Good evening and welcome to another program of Bits and Pieces, New York City, where bit by bit, piece by piece, we want to make you familiar with everything and anything that is happening in and around New York City on the cultural front. This evening, we have a great program for you. We're going to be talking about African arts and culture. All right? With me is Dr. Shabaka, Mr. Anton Craigwell, and Pablo from the corner. Gentlemen, starting with Dr. Shabaka, please introduce yourselves to our audience.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Segun Shabaka. I am the chairperson of the International African Arts Festival, which just completed its 51st annual event. And I'm also chair of the National Association of Kawaida Organization. Our national chair is Dr. Maulana Karenga. And as part of the festival, we normally would have a symposium. That symposium, which is in its 33rd year, we'll be doing that in the coming months because of venue issues. But it is the intellectual component of the International African Arts Festival.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shabaka, and welcome to Bits and Pieces. Antoine, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Andy. Dr. Shabaka, pleasure meeting you. Pablo, nice meeting your countryman.
Same here.
So my name is Antoine Craigwell, and I'm President and CEO of DBGM, which is an organization that is committed to raising awareness about mental health to prevent suicide in Black gay men. As part of my work, we also focus on a mental health conference for LGBTQ plus people of color. And this year, I had a good fortune to meet Dr. Shabaka at the African Festival, and we talked about launching our Ancestral Institute, which is intended as a way to bring together traditional and ancestral healing practices with contemporary psychology to fuse and create a new paradigm construct for mental health care for Black and people of color. So that's just some of the things that I'm involved in, including by training, I'm a journalist and I produce a documentary, and I'm published in a number of different publications, including Oxford University Press. So, there's a whole
All
lot
right.
and a whole lot of stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. Pablo, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Nice, nice. Thank you. It's a pleasure being on. Thanks for the invitation, Brother Nancy. It's a pleasure meeting you, Dr. Shabaka, and my countryman, Antoine. Um, I am a retired pharmaceutical consultant. I worked with Pfizer for a number of decades, retired a few years ago, and I'm currently a creative dabbler. So by that I mean my latest venture is the host and producer of Pablo's Creolis Carna, also known as the Carna, which is a show dedicated to celebrating and showcasing Creole culture and talent through music, poetry, storytelling, and edutainment. So we typically hold the show virtually from Zoom to Facebook Live on the first and third Saturdays at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we usually have a number of guests. In fact, Brother Nancy has been a featured poet and guest on the show a couple of times. And so that's kind of what I'm actively involved in. Other than that, I'm married to June, my bride of 29 years, coming on Saturday, actually. So I've got to remember that to get something for her. So happy anniversary, honey. And I've got three sons, and they're all out of the house, graduated from college, doing well. So I'm a proud dad. I'm happy to be here. I'm also the founder of a Facebook group called Reparations for Descendants or Ascendants of the Enslaved Africans. And our goal really is to inform and educate members about a lot of the atrocities in case many of us have forgotten. So that's me in a
Right.
nutshell. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much. All right, so folks, it's going to be a great conversation. I guarantee you that. So please continue to like, share, tell a friend, grab something cold, something warm, whatever is your preferences, whatever your preference may be, and come and sit with us. We're discussing the African art, the International African Arts and Culture Festival. We will be back with you in just a minute. All right, those are scenes from the recently held International African Arts and Cultural Festival. We'll get to the Dr. Shabaki shortly to tell us, about the festival, how it got started, and so on. But just before, I would like to speak to the other two panelists. Antoine, when you hear, often if you hear the term African arts and culture, what do you see? What do you feel? What do you envisage by just hearing the
term? When I hear African art and culture, I think immediately about masks and drums, music. I think about different other types of representation. I think about indigenous African art. I think about dancing. I think about the drumming and the music. I think about language, and I think about food. One of the things I really would like to get my hands on learning how to do is how to make jollof rice. But also I'm aware when I hear about African art and culture, I look at Guyanese African descendant culture and behavioral practices, and I see very clear similarities in terms of food, music, dance, of course. But one of the things in recent years that came home to me was reading Wole Soyinka, Ake, where he describes village life. And in his description, I could swear to God I was in Buxton or up somewhere of the East Coast in one of the Black villages. The Edo and the Yam, and everybody sitting around and so forth. And you got the sense as if he was talking about Guyanese village life. Okay? And that, to me, after I read Wole Soyinka's Ake, brought the whole thing back to me about African culture, African art. And interestingly enough, you should ask that question, because I celebrate and I enjoy African art. In many of the abstract pieces, when you see them, but I have a difficulty with masks. Okay. Personally, I have a problem with masks and faces, because I never can quite understand what are they trying to tell me? What are they trying to communicate? And
okay, well, I think Dr. Shabaka might help us out a little later on that point. Pablo, what's your take when you hear that phrase, African art and culture? What do you see? What do you feel?
Well, put simply, I see it all as the creative expression of people who look like me. right? And so I feel a sense of pride as a descendant of enslaved captives who were, forcibly removed from the continent of Africa. Um, it makes me feel a sense of pride because a lot of us struggle with identity. My name is James Paul. I've been on interviews where people are surprised to see that I'm actually a Black man with a name James Paul if they haven't seen my photograph before. So there's an identity issue which the arts and culture tend to help resolve for me. So that's kind of how I see it personally.
Okay, thank you for that, Pablo.
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Shabaka, I'll start off with, I'll take a piece from Pablo. He says, people who look like me. Would that be, from your own understanding, would that be correct? Would that be accurate in terms, when we talk about an African? Is it specifically somebody who looks like Pablo?
Yes, of course, to a large extent, it would be uh, expressions of beauty and creativity produced by, and in a sense for, uh, primarily people of African descent, in that it's bringing back the beauty of their life and their imagery, and it's in their own image and interest in terms of the cultural expression that's being produced. So the arts are uh, and come at us in many ways because um, the we say vendors a lot of times of the people that have produced things at festivals. They don't like that term. They consider themselves artisans, in which they've
Okay.
created, used their creativity to produce useful items that are wearable, usable, and so, uh, and that's how we see arts in its essence as, um, an expression or the capacity to take mute matter and create something beautiful with it. And so it is uh, functional, collective, and committed or committing. So it
Hmm.
comes, it's something that's useful. So for a long time, we were, and I'm still not totally into abstract art. I like art that is, I can see something in it. Like people, Europeans have taken dogs and let them paint and say, oh, this is art.
Hmm.
What is that? A dog making a painting, just scratching over some canvas or something. So I'm not into all of that. And, I could see some beauty in some of the abstract art, but
Hmm.
most of the time I want to see, something that's functional that I can relate to. That's an image that I see of our people,
Okay.
expressing the beauty of our
Hmm.
people.
Right. So, what's your take on mask? Antoine, just said that he has a little problem with the mask, and that's a very predominant side of African arts. What's your take on that?
I think I need to take Antoine to Africa with me and let let him see some masks, because you're going to see a lot of masks in African art. A lot of masks, and I mean, I think African masks are beautiful. And if you are to look at, let's say, other masks, and you compare them with African masks, you'll see that African masks are very expressive of African features. And a lot of times, when you look at other masks from other cultures, they're like scary. They have frightening images a lot of times. And so, one time I was working on a project and we were doing a Kwanzaa tape, and somebody had done a cover for the CD that we produced. And I looked at this and I knew right away that it wasn't a black person that did that. The way it looked, I could see that this was a black person, and it was because the image was kind of hard, frightening, you know, had a
Right, right.
monstrosity look to it. So that is to say that to me, and I travel to Africa a few times a year. I take tours, I do groups, and of course, well, you could say West, Northern, Southern Africa, East Africa. You're going to see a lot of masks, and there, for me, there's some. I buy a lot of masks. I got masks all over my house.
Okay.
And I
Doc,
have masks
one second,
for
Dr.
other.
Shabaka. 1 second, Dr. Shabaka. We're going to take a brief break. I'm hearing a lot of static. All right. So we're going to take a brief break and come back to you. All right, we're back. This is Bits and Pieces, and we're talking African art and culture. Antoine, before I get back to Dr. Shabaka, what is it? What is that thing that unsettles you about the African mask?
When I look at African masks, I see many different representations, and I don't see anything that I can easily identify. Um, I see different shapes, um, puzzling for me, not understanding. And I know that different masks, different cultures in Africa have different representations in their masks. They tell different stories. They communicate different messages. Um, and I think what is unsettling for me, and I remember a course I did in Black Studies when I was in college many years ago, and the professor raised the issue and asked a question about the masks that we wear. And so when I look at an African mask, it is understanding for me what are the many different levels or messages that I'm supposed to be seeing here. And because often we don't have an opportunity to really stop and look, and like you guys can see this Dali piece behind me. I like Dali because every time I look at a Dali piece, I see something different. It's a different representation, different imagery, different things come out. But when I look at a mask, it is also too many things for me to understand. And knowing that it is possible a representation of someone's face. So what am I supposed to understand by looking at this? So when I look at
Okay.
your face, when I look at Dr. Shabaka's face, at Pablo's face, I see clearly delineated lines and structure, and I can discern even minuscule expressions or nonverbal cues and so forth. A mask, I can't do that. A mask leaves me kind of like, what else? What is going on? What am I supposed to understand?
I got you. Pablo, I think you may have bought a mask or two. What's your take on that? On that?
Well, I find them interesting. I mean, as a fledgling poet myself, poets use metaphors and so on. I think sculptors would use mask in that same way. So a mask is a metaphor, in my opinion, for things from good to bad, running the gamut. And deities in Africa may represent gods and forces in nature. So I think having a better understanding of what a mask represents would probably help Antoine to kind of diffuse some of that unease about masks. But but just looking at them, I find them to be visually appealing and unique, and especially the colorful one. My wife loves a mask. We've got about 10 in the house, and I definitely don't have that aversion, if you will, or unease, to put it in a better way, that Antoine has.
Okay. Dr. Shabaka, what should we understand about, we of African descent, what should we understand about Mars? What should we take away from that?
Well, I couldn't, I don't know if I'm the person to ask that question because I'm not an expert on African mass, but
Mm-hmm.
I think Antoine has raised a very interesting question. And I think it's a good question to ask the artist. What is he expressing here? Because I don't go that deep into it. And I'm like Pablo, I'll look at a mask and I say, oh, I like that. That's very creative. That's very expressive. And especially sometimes they put beads around it. They do a lot of different creative things with that, usually wood that they've carved. And so now, Antoine, next time I go, I'm going to go to a mask maker and ask them about, the creativity and expression and depth of what they have produced. So the question is very interesting.
Okay. Ta-
I think he's
Go ahead,
on mute.
Anton. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, and as a bit, I want to take a little bit from Pablo and also Dr. Segun is just let me know when you're going to Africa again because I really want to take a trip to Africa. I really would like to do that for a number of reasons, but one of the things that because I'm listening to what Pablo was just talking about, how as a black man, and yourself, Dr. Shabaka, you see a mask, it means nothing. It's just there. It's in all its way you appreciate it. And listening to you guys discuss this just now, I'm beginning to think and ask myself, is it possible that my ancestral removal has been so far down the line that as a consequence, I do not understand and see masks the way you might? And I say that because I am mixed race, black, Indian, and white. And so by proportions of racial mixture, how far removed have I become from indigenous African and by relation African art, that my removal through intermarrying and all the other stuff all the way down the line has actually taken me away from being able to appreciate and understand masks. And then it also might have to do with my own exposure, my cultural exposure as a Guyanese. I never really saw many masks in New Amsterdam. Okay. That was not a place where you would see many African masks. And if you should see an African mask in Guyana, in New Amsterdam, you probably would see it at the Jordanite Church by Stanley Tongue Burial Ground. And you would think that it has, because it's arguably and ostensibly not Christian enough, you will think that it might have something to do with Obeah and voodoo and black arts. So there is already a predisposition, a preconcept about masks in Guyanese culture that seem to tell us that Christianity has come in and so corrupted our minds. We don't see the beauty, the historical, the cultural nuances in masks and the descriptions and the characteristics that you guys would see that I'm not going to see because I may be a product of that removal. Does that make sense?
That's
Well,
that's a large point. That's a very big point you touched on there, Antoine. Now, Dr. Shabaka, I know, I've read, your lecture, you've studied African history, you've grown up in the USA. As you listen to Antoine talk about being far removed and possibly alluding to the reality that maybe it is his mixed heritage that may have contributed to that. But then again, we're in the U.S. where everybody who looks like Antoine, once you have a speck of African lineage, you see it as African. How would you address Antoine based on what he just said?
Well, I would say that I would not have known that cultural background that Antoine mentioned it unless he said it. Anybody looking at Antoine of African descent would say Antoine is black. He's an African person of African descent. And so, but our cultural orientation, our education has oriented us and trained us to be away from who we are, to not look at our African roots and to frown upon those roots and to reject those roots in many ways. So, and sometimes it comes through us through other forces, because I don't care wherever we are, whether you talk about us as Christians, as Muslims, as all these other faiths that we orientate ourselves with. On the surface might be that faith, but underneath it is our African culture and heritage. And that can be suppressed for so much and for so long. And so that's who we are. We're people of African descent, spread out all over the world due to the Holocaust of enslavement. And that African is constantly fighting to come forth and to the forefront. And so this is why we have to talk about learning about our history and culture. So we learn to appreciate ourselves, who we are, and learn how we use that to bring good into the world, to better the world. But it starts with us bettering and enlightening ourselves and our community. So it's not surprising that we have this ambivalence towards Africa, because that's what we were trained to do in this country. That's how they kept us under the gun, under the plantation, under the suppression of enslavement, was to kind of strip away our African mind. Because if you read African history and culture, you know that what the Europeans feared the most during the Holocaust of enslavement was the influx of new Africans, because they knew freedom. They had not been on the plantation for generations. They had not been totally wiped out in terms of their mind. And so they knew freedom, and they were the most rebellious for a good while in terms of the Holocaust and enslavement system. And so we need to regenerate that rebellion in us in terms of first coming into our own consciousness by learning our history and our culture, by learning about our heroes and heroines, about the good things that we've done. For instance, I just read an article about this brother that was the major force behind the Weber satellite that they just put into space. Now, normally, if you think about it, we would not know that for decades sometimes. We don't know the role that our people are playing in these world endeavors, okay? But we learned that, I can't think of his name right now. Maybe it'll come to me. I mean, he was the person that pulled it all together. And if you saw the photo of Biden talking about it, he was on the bottom, not as last, but he was really the foundation. And people acknowledged that he had been the force that was the glue that allowed for this to happen. And so my point is that we are in this mix more than we think we are, and we are producing great things in this world. But it's because we don't know our history and culture that we are lacking. And so we don't know that we can produce things. I've said for years that we go through 12, 16, 20 years of formal education in this society, in this hemisphere, and we never have a course in our own history and culture. What do you think that does to us? You know?
Okay.
And so when you look at what is happening to us around the world with little history and culture, yet we're still doing great things. Imagine if we really knew who we are and what we brought to this world, this universe, over the millenniums that we've been here.
Okay. I'll take that question to Pablo. What is Pablo, in your view, what is the absence of, the teaching of African history and culture? What has it done to us?
Well, it's more like, what has that been replaced with? So as the descendants of the enslaved or captives from Africa, it was in the colonizers' interests to justify this Holocaust, this enslavement, this brutality, this inhumanity against people, human beings, essentially, by making the case that we were inferior, right? And so that continued, and many of us are affected by that in many ways. We look at the divisions amongst people, descendants in the diaspora, and even in continental Africa, right? Many of that stems from that conscious indoctrination, that westernization of our minds, and the way we think, the way we dress, the way we talk. My name is James Paul. There's dissonance between my name and me, right? So I struggle with that, and I really respect folks like Dr. Shabaka, correct? Sorry, for taking that step. I'm presuming that's not the name you were given at birth. Is that correct?
No,
Dr. Shabaka?
no. But
Am I correct?
I took it early.
Early. So you changed early. Gotcha.
Like early 20s.
Absolutely. And I really think that's an important step, because identity starts with the label of who we are, the name, and I think many of us, Antoine and myself, and Andy as well, at some level, there's always going to be that level of dissonance. And so I think it's a journey getting to a place where we feel comfortable with everything African, because that's who we are. And as Dr. Shabaka said, I think as we become more educated and informed, and that comes by going to Africa and being a part of the festival in New York, and African festivals wherever they exist in America, would help us diffuse that dissonance and restore that sense of pride that we all should have of everything African. So that's how I look at it.
Okay, thank you for that. Antoine, you've heard the phrase, I think both Dr. Shabaka and Pablo have used it. That's who we are. But then just now you talk about, you spoke about your mixed heritage. When you hear that phrase, that's who we are, and you think of Antoine Craigwell, who and what do you see in this part of the conversation?
So you're asking a question then about my identity and how do I perceive and understand my sense of self, my identity. But it depends on the locus, on which environment, which community am I going to be identified with. As an individual, I carry many different identities. Like I shared earlier, I talked about being mixed race. So I share three different races and three different cultures and identities that come with those cultures. But I'm also Guyanese, and I live in the United States. And so it depends on which identity is going to be operative or operant at any given moment. Um, so in a short answer, I would suggest that as an individual, I am multifaceted, and so is each of us. And each of us brings into even this particular environment a multitude of different identities and histories and experiences. Um, some may be separate, some may be cooperative. But it's interesting also that both Dr. Shabaka and Pablo talked about dissonance and talk about separation and talk about being disconnected. That I remember a few years ago, there's a psychologist, a Black psychologist in Chicago, who did a presentation at Sisters of Tongue Bookstore in Washington, just early Washington Heights and by 155th Street in Amsterdam. And he showed us that the concept of Black history in the United States is only taught or understood from 1619 onwards. That rather, Black history predates and goes back for millennia on the continent. And that on the continent, when if and when we should enter into that history, we discover how great, how prolific, how vibrant, how resourceful, how resilient we are and we have been over millennia. I'm still fascinated by one of the early universities in Africa, the university in Timbuktu. Okay, I'm always amazed at the adobe architecture that you find in Sudan and Mali and Chad and Niger. Um, I'm in awe of a whole lot of that, but then I'm in awe of it as perhaps an outsider, a tourist, because it's not something that I'm really connected to. My identities, my different identities have separated me from that. And which is why, Dr. Shabaka, when I met you at the event, and I know that you were preoccupied, and we talked about the work that I'm doing about the Ancestral Institute. This is why the Ancestral Institute that we are launching this year is so important. Because one of the arguments we make is that as long as humans have walked the earth, we've struggled with mental illness. We've struggled with mental health. But we never understood it the way that the Western Europeans and Americans have encouraged us to think about it. And our ancestors clearly would have had means and practices and rituals and different ways of addressing and dealing with mental illness in our communities, in their families, in the village life. But because of that separation and the enslavement that followed and the atrocities that were visited on us, that we and as well as the indoctrination that we were subject to, that a lot of ourselves have been removed. And that to see that in the 1920s, the early 20th century, late 1800s and early 20th century, we were used as experiments to determine what mental illness looked like in white people, because we were and we still are not seen exclusively as human. We were always seen as people who don't feel pain because we are not human. But what does mental illness look like in Black people? How similar or different is it? And that's why we are doing what we're doing in October. Because again, to Dr. Shabaka's point, is identifying and reconnecting with that which is already in us, reconnecting with that which is part of our DNA, but has never been allowed the opportunity to surface, to express itself. Does that make you understand what I'm saying, Andy?
Yeah, I get you. No,
And hang
the
on,
point you
and hang on, and where in that whole construct is we find our sense of self and our identities, and how do we then relate those identities with that ancestral self? Are you with me?
we with you. We with you. All right.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I want to tap into you spoke about mental illness, and I thought time and again the fact that movement and the drums have always been a part, an integral part of the healing process amongst Africans. Um, what would your research have instructed? How would your research have instructed you with regard to that point, Dr. Shabaka? In terms of drumming and movement as part of the healing process.
Well, as you would know, for African people in this hemisphere, I don't know what we would be like if we didn't have music and rhythm in our lives. Uh, I see a lot of mental illness every day in this city, more than I've ever seen. You know, I had someone screaming outside of my house a few hours ago and come over to the office here and someone's out there screaming. Different. So mental health is a big problem. But I think a large part of it is because the breakdown of relationships in our lives and that people are not in healthy relationships or being respected in relationships as human beings, as African people. In this country, one of its founding sociologists, de Tocqueville, said that America insanity is very much a part of the fabric of this country. And how can it not be when you look at the history of the Holocaust against Native Americans and then the Holocaust against African people and not think that that's going to drive some people crazy of all different hues. And so the music in our lives has been a healing force. And when people are able to use that creativity, it's really to keep them together in many ways, bring out the beauty in their lives and in life. But, you know, to save us from the madness around us. And the drum in African culture or music in African culture, in most cultures, are very, very important. My first trip to Africa, I still have the book, 1971, and it's a small book, but it talks about music in African culture, and it talks about how there are different drums in some cultures for different life cycle events that you don't play in other life cycle events. There's different rhythms that you play for this event. And so that's the idiosyncrasies of music in African culture. So there are special instruments that you play depending on the social, cultural, political event. So music in African culture is very, very important, like it is to us. I'm talking about continental African culture as well as diaspora African culture.
Right. Okay.
And this is why studying our history is so important, because we can see things and we can See, a lot of times we don't connect because we don't know the history and the culture. But once you start studying, you could see different things. And you brothers coming from somewhere that is not as stripped of its African roots as, let's say, black people in America. Because black people in America, this was the harshest terrain that they could put you in. This was the harshest terrain, brutal. And this was almost punishment if you were rebelling in the Caribbean or in South America. If the English could get you here, the French, they had parts Spanish, Louisiana Purchase, that was the French. Napoleon had to give it up because he got a whipping in Haiti. He got spanked in Haiti, and he didn't want the British to have the territory, so he gave Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson. That was one of the biggest land deals in the history of humanity. And then you had the Spanish, I think, in Florida. So different, but this was more of a punishing territory. And so if you go to, like you can go to probably in Guyana, if you study the language, you will probably hear more words on the African continent than I will having been here. And there are a lot of words that we use here that are used, that are germane to African culture. But we have to do the research. And that's our job at this late date in history, is to do the research, make the connection, to make our people whole again. They have to be whole again. They have to heal from 400 years of Holocaust and having their mind, a lobotomy performed on their brain and putting the European mind in our heads. We have to put our own mind back in our heads. So culture is key. And culture is the totality of thought and practice of a people. And we say that culture has three key aspects to it, especially Pan-African culture, African culture. And one is because culture is the most defining feature of a people. In order to be itself and free itself, a people must be self-determining, self-conscious, and rooted in its own culture. And the quality of life. Third, the quality of life of a people is determined by it making cultural revolution within and political revolution without, resulting in a radical transformation of self, society, and the world. So culture is everything we do and everything we think and everything we do. And we have to see it in its fullest sense, not song and dance, not food and festivals, but the totality of thought and practice on at least 7 basic levels: history, spirituality, religion, political organization, economic organization, creative production, art, music, literature, psychology. I missed one in there. Let me see: history, economics, politics, social organization, political organization. History.
Is it religion or spirituality?
Spirituality, history, religion and spirituality, social organization, political organization, economic organization, and creative production, art, music, literature, film, those creative expressions we talk about, and then psychology, ethos, collective consciousness. What we've been done here to us is to keep us divided, but we have to be seeking our collective consciousness, what brings us together, not what divides us, because that's how we were conquered as a people. If we had been united, the Europeans could not have come and captured us and conquered us in Africa, because they sowed division among us that we ended up here. The same thing with the Native Americans. If the Native Americans had been united, we'd have a different world because the Europeans wouldn't have penetrated it. So unity is very important, and so we have to be constantly seeking to be true Pan-Africanists and to fight off this onslaught to keep us divided in so many different ways.
All right. I want to take that point about unity and the fact that lack of unity, has been disruptive to our lives and our history. Pablo, as a writer, as a poet, time and again you would look around you for ideas. You would look at your own personal life. You would read. You look at the news. Kind of get a sense of what's happening before you put pen to paper or you begin to type. Right. Um, what's your take on the unity question and how much does it affect who we are as a people?
Well, I think unity is something that deserves a lot of research, right? I wanted to ask Dr. Shabak, and I'm going to get back to answering that question.
Go ahead.
Is the label Black an African construct, or is it a European construct, a label of convenience to visually look at people with pigmentations like ours and put them in this category of Black? Dr. Shabaka.
I don't quite understand the question. Could you?
Okay, so let's say we're going back to the first time Europeans came into contact with the African continent. How did Africans see themselves? Was Black a term, or whatever the word for Black is in Africa? Let's say you're Yoruba, or you're, Igbo, or you're Hausa in Nigeria. You're looking at each other. You all look the same. You'd never seen a pale-faced person until the first European came into that part of the world. How did they see themselves?
They saw themselves most likely in their ethnicity. They're Yoruba, Dogon, etc. But they probably saw the Europeans as odd and maybe even monsters, So,
yes.
But they didn't treat them because the culture and the ethics demand that they even treat the stranger with dignity and give food and water to them. So that was the culture, unlike European culture. And so I'm sure, based on my study of African history and culture, that of course they saw them as strange. But remember, Africa is the mother and father of humanity. So Africa, to some extent, has a variety of ethnicities and cultures.
Yes.
So
but they all look like us for the most part. For the most part.
Not so sure about that. To a large extent,
back in the 15th century. Back in the 15th century in Western Africa.
Yeah, but let's go back millenniums. Okay. Y'all use the word millenniums. Go back millenniums. Gotcha. And what we don't know for sure, but we do know that it wasn't such a thing as race and racism. That's a social construct.
Right.
You see, it's not a biological. It's only one race, the human race, and it was European racism that created this idea that there's these different humanities.
That's the essence of what I was trying to get to. So you've got this construct of Black, which, based on my research, is a European construct because Black is an English Latin term, right? And we have embraced that, right? And I wonder whether there is some trouble with that because we are unique. There are thousands of ethnicities in Africa, right? Thousands of tribes and tribal dialects. And so we are not simply Black, right? No. And so I in one of my pieces, Andy spoke about me doing my research. One of my poems It's like someday I yearn to be something beyond black, like science, like beauty, like humanity, right? Because I find the label black has been used conveniently by our white colonizers to put us in this category of less than them. And so I see many some academics gravitating more towards the term African as an identity that's better
Well,
suited to that healing process that Dr. Shabaka and Antoine spoke about. And so I
well,
try
I
to.
get,
And Antoine, I would like to hear your take. Given some of your earlier points on the matter of black being a construct of the European mind.
Actually, I wanted to, because it seemed like Dr. Shabaka wanted to jump in and comment or add something to what Pablo was saying. I have a couple of thoughts on where this discussion is and stuff, but Dr. Shabaka, do you want to, you gonna say something?
yes, yes. Appreciate what's been said, if I understand correctly. I mean, listen, we use black and African as two sides of the same coin, so to speak, as Baba Dingi Sitoli from Zimbabwe would say. That it's African and black to us, to me, it's the same thing. When I say black, I mean African. When I say African, I mean black people. So we get our identity from two major sources: where we are and where we're from. Okay? Of course, most people have in this country has two identities because most of them came from somewhere else. It's the Native American that has been here that's the real American, the original American. Okay, most of us came from somewhere else. So we say we're African Americans, Africans in America. Okay, you have British, French, all these different Spanish in America. So our identity is from two sources. So and our identity is from a place. That's our primary identity. All these other identities that we have, they're secondary identities.
Okay.
We take them on in life. We become Christians, then we might change and be a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Bata. So this secondary identity, is secondary. Our primary identity, our Africanness, we were African or black before we were born. Okay, we were these things. These other ones come with our birth, and we take them on and we change them. We shed them and bring something else on. But our primary identity, our first identity, is our Africanness, or whatever else may be. I'm talking about African people, you're black people, so we're talking about our Africanness. And so we have to learn this identity because it's key to who we are. First thing we need, and what we say we're struggling for, is identity, purpose, and direction. As people, as humans, we want to know who we are, where we are, what we're doing here, what's our purpose in life. And so you get that from understanding your history and culture. So I would rest there for right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shabaka. Antoine, you can go ahead and make your point.
A couple of things on that, and I see that Dr. Shabaka is actually coming around to where I talked earlier about the sense of identity is relative to one's locus and one's culture. Incidentally, Pablo, like I said to you, I knew I was born in Islington, and I was figuring out the other day that my navel string is buried in Islington. And we know for Guyanese, your sense of identity is rooted into where your navel string is buried. And maybe that is something that is also rooted in African cultures, that wherever your the shriveled up piece of flesh that was the umbilical cord attached to your navel, where that is buried, that is where your sense of identity, that's where you belong. The people, the culture, the environment, that's where you belong. But to just step back a little bit, I think from Dr. Shabaka, who may have studied this more extensively than I, might probably suggest that origins of the term Black or Negro originated originally in Rome, pre-Christian times. For the early Egyptians, Black people were referred to as Nubians because they were associated with the land of Nubia just to the south, in Sudan and Ethiopia and below. But it wasn't until a Dutch merchant in the 17th century in the Netherlands coined the term Negro as a way to differentiate Black people from white people. And he was part of the Dutch East India Trading Company, which is one of the most vicious and prolific trading companies that started the whole slave trade and the abuses against indigenous peoples, not just in Africa, but in India and everywhere else. And so it was the Dutch who set out that, creating that whole race, that whole conversation about race. And I was interested that Dr. Shabaka was just talking about how, when you asked the question, Pablo, about how Black people saw themselves, how indigenous Africans saw themselves. And it is interesting that he should comment and suggest that it wasn't from a perspective of race, which is a European construct of skin color, but it was from a perspective of ethnicity and culture. Consequently, why we see in many indigenous African countries, you have the body marks. Why we see in some, you have the body marks, you have the tattoos, or even going all the way to Micronesia and the South Pacific, okay, and Southeast Asia, where you have the indigenous peoples tattoo themselves, okay, and the tattoos convey different types of messaging, what tribe you come from, what your ancestry, all this information is transmitted through outward appearance. And so we see in indigenous African communities, in villages, the marks. So you have the facial marks, you have the marks on the arms or the legs, on the back, okay? You have different representations. It's all about ethnicity and culture, because that is where your identity lies, in that you belong not just to the moment where I am identifying you as from a particular tribe or culture, but it is the entire ancestry that is linked and that you now represent. And incidentally, which is what again comes back, kind of come full circle, in a sense that Black people in the diaspora have lost touch with that connection and our sense of ancestry. And whether fortunately or not, that we now have the DNA profiling that helps us understand where we come from, who we are. I have a little bit of a problem with that DNA profiling, because we know that they share that information with the federal law enforcement, and that are then added to use for more profiling for yourself and for your family members. But that's another conversation. But it is important, I think, that helps us to identify and reconnect with some aspect of our sense of self, our identity, who we are, where we came from. What are some of the things about our culture, about our people, about our ethnicity that we needed to know? So, for example, Pablo, you know, and I don't know if Dr. Shabaka, if you've been to Guyana, you had the experience of a kwekwe. Okay? Kwekwe is rooted in Western Africa, rooted in West Africa, but you know, as a kwekwe that goes all night, it's the drumming, it's the dancing, and it has both a number of different sociological constructs built into it. Not just about celebrating the upcoming nuptials, about the two people getting married, not just about the whole construct of procreation, of how you're going to have sex and how the sex is going to be done. It's not just about that, but it's also a form of expiation. Because when we hear the drums, and like we say, you catch comfort, and you start dancing comfort, you catch banter, and you start dancing, and you dance until the sweat dripping off of you, and the drums are talking to each other. But that becomes a form of expiation for all those who are attending that kwekwe, because why? We are able to release some of the tension, some of the stress, some of the pressure that we've been living with, and reconnecting with that which we know. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yes,
We got you. We got you. Yes, sir. All right.
I don't know why Andy just bring me on these things, because you know that.
you're watching a little conversation on African arts and culture. We'll be back to round up this evening's broadcast. We'll be back shortly.
Yeah. From the wake up this morning, things are Watch out, Jaja. Give me love my life now. Everywhere is bright now. Oh, I say watch out, Jaja. Bring woman some nice now. What more could I ask for? What we say? One from to go down and walk out. She is a girl and I want to see what he can when I'm no more. Life is short and tomorrow not sure, so I live like it's my last. Whoa, streets in the yard. Now, chop up and where's the grand now? Check up and girl with the man now. Sweet, yeah. Sometimes I feel like I know when I go.
All right. All right. Welcome back. All right. We're gonna kind of wrap up where we're going. I mean, we touched on some things that by themselves we're gonna have a whole new conversation about that. But back to you, Dr. Shabaka. When this idea started to have and host the African Arts and Cultural Festival, you said it's 51 years old now. So we're looking at the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. What was the driving force at that time for the launching of the African Arts and Cultural Festival?
Yes. Before I go there, though, I want to make two follow-ups to Brother Antoine's remarks just now. One is, it's, when I said earlier about people in the Caribbean and South America being closer to African culture. Now, you see, like when you talk about the umbilical cord being buried, that's very much an African practice. And I can't think of who it was. It might have been Mandela or someone that I read recently that talked about that. Okay? So that's where we got to study the history and culture and see how that connects. So that's a very important point you made, and I find it like fascinating that you know, but there's a lot of things we do that are connected to our African roots, but we've been cut off, so we don't know. The other thing is, one of the theories about the marks on that Africans use, and that they say developed during the Holocaust and slavery, and one of the reasons was because people were being captured. And so when you saw the mark, you know that that was your ethnic group, but that was someone you could communicate with. Because one of the things the Europeans did during the Holocaust of slavery was to keep us from being able to talk to each other. On my first trip to Africa, I went to the dungeons in Ghana. And one of the things they spoke about was that they had linguists, people from our own ethnic group, that would listen out and see who was conspiring to rebel, and they would cut their tongues out. So just any conversation, you would be penalized for that. And so something like having these marks, with you could easily identify your other ethnic group or someone in your ethnic group, and you know automatically you could talk to that person, communicate with that person. So that's another idea or theory about those markings that people did, particularly on their face and body. Now, the history of the festival. The festival comes out of a cultural and educational group that was part of the Kawaida philosophy and movement developed by Dr. Maulana Karenga. The East Cultural and Educational Center was the Black Power organization of New York City. It was the major Black Power organization of New York City. And what did we say Black Power was? Three things primarily. The struggle and movement for self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense. The East Cultural and Educational Center had many components, but just let me give you a few. One was a daycare, a newspaper, a cultural center in which we heard music and had some of the best, mainly jazz musicians from around the world. We had a food co-op, and we had the major part of it was a school. At our peak, we had over 500 students that came to our school daily. And in 71, we had a celebration and a fundraiser for our students that were graduating. And that was when we had the first festival on Claver Place. And that's how the festival started on 10 Claver Place, a 2-block area. We had probably a couple of dozen vendors. We would do the food, so that would bring us in the revenue, a lot of revenue. And we had probably a couple of thousand patrons that came out to support it. And from there, it grew. And for the first 5 years, we remained until about 76. We remained and held the festival on Claver Place. And then we moved to Boys and Girls High School Field. And we were there for 20-something years until 2003. Or I should say probably 2001, 2002, because we were on Fulton Street because they renovated the field at Boys and Girls, and so we could not use it anymore. So we were in limbo. We were homeless, and we held the festival right there outside of Boys and Girls on Fulton Street and Schenectady for 1 or 2 years, and then we moved to our present location at Commodore Barry Park in 2003. And so that is the history, briefly, of the festival. So it started as part of the East Cultural and Educational Center back in 1971 in Brooklyn. And the East was a major institution in that what we're talking about here is African culture and history. The East was the organization that, as we say, prioritized Africa as our root and heritage and made it an ideal, a spiritual and moral ideal that we could look up to, and as a culture that was second to none in terms of what we offered humanity.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Shabaka. Pablo, your closing remark.
Yes, I want to thank Dr. Shabaka for answering my wife's question about the various locations for the festival, because she had asked that question on my show on the Karna, and we didn't get an answer. So she was correct that you were at Boys and Girls High for a number of years, and then you kind of were in limbo for a year or two, and then you're now at the current place at Commodore Barry Park. So thank you for that. And yeah, I want to wrap things up by saying the question that I get asked quite often is, yes, we've got a beautiful culture. We are talented, we are creative, we are musical, we are athletic. But ultimately, that's one thing to have all of these abilities and all these resources. But it seems like we have to accept that our ancestors failed in some way to protect those resources. Whether it was Dr. Shabaka had mentioned that they were hospitable people, but over 400 years, there has to become a recognition that, you know what, this person does not deserve my hospitality. They are actually killing and raping and shackling and people that look like me. So my question is, what are some of the internal factors? We often look at, for example, Dr. Walter Rodney talks about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But I wanted to ask Dr. Shabak and Antoine as well, what are some of the internal forces? How did Africa underdevelop Africa as well? And I think if we really examine those things internally and not, we know what the white man did, but I feel that ultimately the solution to understanding the internal forces, because we tend to ignore that quite a bit. I think that is the key to really saying, you know what, we have got to identify those things and figure out a way to change them so that we can be more united in terms of defending all things African. Because to this day, we can't say that there is a first world, to use the European label, African nation in the continent of Africa that are run by people like you and I, right? And so I would like that to be investigated. That would be my commentary, my closing commentary, is to have us investigate those internal factors that contributed to me being called James Paul, Antoine, Craigwell, Anansi, Chichester, and of course Dr. Shabaka. He did the right thing and changed his name in the 20s. So that would be my closing commentary. I think that's important.
Excellent point. Of course, that would be a whole nother 90-minute or 90-day
Yes, yes.
conversation. So we're going to deal with that another time. Antoine, your closing note.
I'm thinking that the white colonialists did not have too much work to do to further divide us, because in many ways we were already divided, by race, by ethnicity, by culture, by economic, by commerce. To understand, Pablo, that slavery had already existed in the continent of Africa before the white people came. There were internecine forms of slavery and property ownership, but there was also it was exploited and profited by the Arabs who came across from the
Yes.
Arabian Peninsula to the east of Africa, and down the east of Africa all the way down to Madagascar, where it proliferated. So there were some of the enslaved that were shipped to the New World, to the Caribbean and Southern and America, were actually brought by overland in an arduous journey from Madagascar and from the east coast of Africa. But what I think is also important to understand is that the white people came in, saw something that they can profit off of, and exploited that, and exploited it to the nth degree. And one of the things that I think, one of the most effective things that, and we see it today still from the British, is the concept of divide and conquer. And so what the British learned and did is how best to separate peoples, pit them against each other as a way to enforce control. And so if they can turn us against and make us despise each other, make us distrust each other, then ultimately they are able to maintain control, because we are going to snitch and turn on each other. And interestingly enough, I don't know, well, Andy might have seen it on my Facebook page. I posted a comment, an observation, yet passing on the sidewalk in Harlem and speaking loudly to her 5 or 7-year-old son who was walking with her, saying to him quite clearly and loudly, I don't trust you. I don't believe you. You're a snitch. Okay? And what was important in what she was saying is not that she was denigrating him, but she was stamping into his brain how he will now begin to see himself as he gets older. Unless someone intervenes to correct and change that neurological pathway in his brain and that understanding of himself, he will continue to see himself as someone who cannot be trusted, who is not believed, and who is afraid or will snitch and tell on others. And so the concept of division is already part of what we do. We set upon each other. We look out. One of the interesting things about it, though, from a much more macro or a global perspective, is as humans, as people, as human beings, regardless of the ethnicity or culture or race, however you want to put it, self-preservation is always paramount for each of us. And we will undertake and do whatever it takes for our own survival, even if it means snitching, telling on, turning against one of our own. And so we see that over time, for economic benefit, for security, for access to food and water and housing and shelter, that we will manipulate, we will do things against each other. Is it because it is inherent to us as humans? Or is it something that we can break, a cycle that we can break? Is it something that is rooted in our DNA as part of the trauma that courses through us and influences all of our thoughts, our actions, and our decisions? Or is it something that we can break in our lifetimes? How can I then, as an individual, in my relationships with Dr. Shabaka, with you, Pablo, with Andy, when confronted with a situation where I have to make a choice, that I can put myself last for any one of your benefit, or instead would I put myself first and cast you off to the side? At what point am I breaking that cycle?
Okay.
But that's a larger
and another set of very excellent points. It's another 90 days conversation. Dr. Shabaka, I'll come to you last. Please give us your closing notes, and then we're out of it.
Well, I think we can't have defeatist views about what's going on around us. And we can't have a negative perspective on what's going on in our community. We have to believe in our people and their capacity to be involved and take control, seize control of their lives. The damage that's been done to us is tremendous, but look what we've come through and still pushing forward. So this is why we talk about culture, and we say before we can win any other battle, we must first win the hearts and minds of our people. And that is through culture. That is through re-teaching them their history and culture and giving them new views and values in which they can stand up and fight and engage in this honorable, tremendous, awesome struggle that we've been waging as African people in this hemisphere, but also as human beings to create a better, more dignified world. And we have so many issues that are confronting us as a species. The planet, the health of the planet is unraveling. And you all know because you have some level of rainforest in Guyana, and people in South America are losing that very important entity too. And so we see different things happening that is really putting the planet in peril. And who's going to stop that? Black people have to be part of this movement to turn things around. And we start with where we are, and we start first as seeing ourselves as the beneficiaries of this new world we want to create, and as having to wage a struggle, not just for us, but for our progeny, future generations that are going to inherit this planet and this life and this struggle. And so we have to build organizations and institutions. And that's what I think we are afraid of. We are more comfortable working on these modern day plantations rather than building our own organizations and institutions. And that's what we have to begin to internalize if we really want to see change. We have to take on those responsibilities. We have to support those organizations and institutions that are trying to move our people forward. And so we can't think pessimistically. I mean, you're going to get that. It's enough of it around us, so you can't avoid it. But that should be help you drive forward more forcefully to hear things that, you know, you just know that we can't internalize with so much, because we have to move forward. We have to bring more people into this fold. We have to create these relationships, and we have to build these organizations that are going to bring about the change that we know has to come forth. We are our own liberators. Europeans are responsible for our oppression, but we're responsible for our liberation. And so we have to march with that in our mind and heart, and know that we have to come forth with the best in us to be ourselves and free ourselves. Free ourselves and be ourselves. That's what the struggle is for. These are simultaneous acts. We want to be ourselves as we free ourselves. We don't want to be a caricature of the monstrosity and culture that created us. And so it's a dual process, and it's ongoing. And I would say it's never ending, because we're always learning, evolving, and moving forward. So let's understand that, and let's see and study our history and culture more, and let's be more engaging of our own history and culture.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Shabaka, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on. Antoine, thank you for making the connection. It was a real pleasure having you. Pablo, thanks for taking the time out, coming, taking a step away from the corner and coming on, and Antoine. All right, so Alfred Adams, Dudley Charles, everyone else who, you know, who came in, anybody else who commented, thank you all for joining this podcast. We hope that there was something from it that you can take away, something that you can ponder, something maybe you've been encouraged to research, or maybe you've been encouraged to start a fight, or if you're not fighting already. All right. So thank you so much, and this is all for now. Thank you.
Chair.
Yep.